I want to say something today about the infancy stories of the Gospel. And I want to start with a section on imitative historiography. As Christmas approaches, our thoughts are inevitably drawn to the Gospel stories of the birth and infancy of the Lord. The first Gospel, Mark, gives us no introduction about Jesus' early life, but starts immediately with the baptism of Jesus. John, the theologian, gives us his incomparable prologue on the Word made flesh. Matthew and Luke, on the other hand, each give us a detailed story of some incidents in the birth and infancy of Jesus. These two differ widely from one another in such a way that it's difficult to reconcile them in every detail. They're clearly written from widely different viewpoints and intended to convey different messages. As the decree of Vatican II on Revelation insists in section 12 of that decree, the sacred writers use the literary genres current in their day. In this day, the genre is best described as imitative historiography, imitative history writing. It consists in bringing out the significance of an incident by narrating it in a pattern and in a language reminiscent of a previous historical incident. The aim of the writing is not so much to show the historical details of the later occasion as to stress its similarity to the earlier, well-known occasion, and so illustrate its importance. A consideration of two other gospel incidents may clarify this technique. The story of the Ascension and the return of the disciples to Jerusalem in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, is modeled on the departure of Elijah in his fiery chariot and Elisha's reception of his spirit, symbolized by the gift of his cloak in 2 Kings 2. In the same way, the disciples will receive the Spirit of Jesus and carry on his mission. By the reception of Jesus' Spirit, the disciples are the heirs of Jesus, just as by receiving his cloak, Elisha is the heir of Elijah. Another, more complicated version of the story is the murder of John the Baptist by Herod Antipas. This is modeled on the murder of Naboth by King Ahab in 1 Kings 21. The innocent Baptist is Naboth. The vacillating Herod, who in fact was only a tetrarch, is souped up to being a king. The part of the wicked Jezebel, princess from Tyre, a pagan, is played by the vengeful Herodias, also brought in from elsewhere. For good measure, the memorable phrase about half my kingdom is spliced in from the story of Esther disposing of her enemy, Haman, featuring Herodias' daughter to add a touch of sex and vengeance. According to Josephus, Antipas had the Baptist eliminated to avoid any danger of a rebellion. But the process of the elimination of the Baptist, sketched by the biblical story, is quite compatible with the political motivation, adding both spice and a moral lesson. The purpose of the details is not to describe the later event, so much as to bring out its wickedness by its similarity to the murder of Naboth. Other instances of such imitative historiography might be mentioned in order to stress the value to the evangelists of showing the place of Jesus in the biblical tradition. The same sequence of conversation or argument occurs between Jesus and the disciples at the feeding of the 5,000, as between Elisha and his disciples at Elisha's miraculous feeding in the second book of Kings, 42 to 2 Kings 4, 42 to 44. The prophet gives an order, then the disciples point out the absurdity of the order, the prophet repeats the order, and then the prophet is justified. This shows that first Elisha and then Jesus are prophets feeding their disciples, just as Moses fed his people in the desert. Only Jesus' miracle, 5 loaves for 5,000 people, as opposed to 20 loaves for 100 people, is much greater. Such an instance may be quite delicately touched on, even by a mere phrase, as in Luke's story of Jesus raising the dead boy at 9. Luke's always careful, of course, to maintain sexual equality, and just as Mark shows Jesus raising from the dead the female child of a father, Jairus, so Luke inserts the story of Jesus raised from the dead, the male child of a mother. At the end of this story, Jesus gave him back to his mother, Luke 7:15, using the same words as the similar story about Elijah giving to his mother the male child. Jesus stands in the tradition of the ancient prophets. It may also be significant that the village of Nain is located in the Elisha country, the foothills of the Carmel range. So much for imitative historiography. Now let's move on to Luke's infancy stories. With these examples of imitative historiography in mind, we may turn to the infancy stories of the 2 Gospels, and first Luke. The most obvious feature of the infancy accounts in both Gospels is, of course, the long-awaited birth and vocation of God's servant. The announcement and birth of God's messengers is a recurrent motive throughout the Old Testament. Examples are the births of Isaac, Samson, and Samuel, and also in a slightly modified form, the vocation of Gideon in Judges 6. The first example is the visit of the 3 divine figures to Abraham to announce the birth of an heir to Abraham, when both prospective parents are too old to allow a natural birth. Both Abraham and Sarah laugh. In fact, that's a pun on the name Yitzhak, God will smile. The other stories of a miraculous birth display the same pattern to emphasize the special divine intervention. At the end of the Annunciation story to Mary, the angel's conclusion is a direct response to Sarah's doubt. Sarah says in Genesis, "Is anything impossible to God?" And in Luke 1:37, she says, "Nothing is impossible to God." Each time, the birth is specially organized by God. A constant feature of these announcements is of a miraculous or amazing birth is the objection of God's servant and the reassurance of the messenger that the impossible will happen. In Abraham's case in Genesis 17, and of course it occurs in the announcement to Samuel's mother, 1 Samuel 1, and of course to Joseph in Matthew, and to Zechariah in Luke, where Zechariah uses the same words as Abraham, "How can I know this?" and Mary. Another feature is the Thanksgiving song of the parent. Hannah in 1 Samuel, the Magnificat, the Benedictus, and the Nunc Dimittis, not of a parent, Adam. A special feature of the birth of Jesus is the song of the angels, as though at the birth of Jesus the whole world bursts into song. Nearly a quarter of the 2 chapters consist of the songs, giving the whole narrative an air of a joyful celebration of the events. And Luke, that master of stylistic variation, is perfectly capable of composing those splendid hymns of thanksgiving with all their biblical allusions. In addition, the presentation of Jesus in the temple by his parents comes as a repeat of the presentation of Samuel in the temple by his mother. In the same way, the journey of the pregnant Mary to her cousin Elizabeth may be seen as an echo of the journeys of Samuel's pregnant mother in 1 Samuel 1. So these features align the birth of Jesus with the wonderful birth of God's agents in the Old Testament. By contrast, however, this makes the birth of Jesus stand out all the more as the only birth from a virgin mother, though it may be questioned whether the knowledge of genetics at the time was sufficiently advanced to recognize a birth to a virgin as being totally of a different order of wonder from birth to an elderly person. It's perhaps a mistake to attempt to establish an order of degrees of miraculosity. So much for Luke. Now Matthew's infancy stories. Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus is far darker and more somber than Luke's. In all Matthew's writing, it's clear that he's writing from within the Jewish tradition. In the first instance, he's writing for Christians who have come from the Jewish tradition and who are, in some instances, at loggerheads with the Jewish tradition. Matthew's understanding of obedience to the law and so of righteousness is entirely different from the legal attitude of many of the Jews. His account of Jesus' ministry ends with the swingeing sevenfold condemnation of the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23. He can't bear to tell us that Jairus, whose daughter was raised to life, was the leader of the synagogue, as he is in Mark. By Matthew, he's presented simply and indeterminately as a ruler, not a leader of the synagogue. In the final discussion about the greatest of the commandments, in Mark, Jesus praises the scribe who asked the question, says he is not far from the kingdom of heaven. Whereas in Matthew, the lawyer puts the question merely to catch Jesus out, and he receives no praise at all. In accordance with this, one of the principal messages of Matthew's infancy stories is that although Jesus is fully in accord with the tradition of Moses, indeed the fulfillment of this tradition and its wisdom, nevertheless the official representative of Orthodox Judaism stood against Jesus from the start. Against this background, it is not surprising that the first public scene in Matthew presents a sharp contrast between King Herod the Jew and the Gentile wise men. The same contrast as will be presented in the final scene of the judgment of Jesus, where the Jews emphatically reject Jesus and the Gentile Pilate 3 times pronounces him innocent. So in the infancy stories, the same contrast is evident. While King Herod plots to destroy this new potential rival, the wise men from the East, in a typical piece of imitative historiography, mirror Job's comforters, bringing the fabled wisdom of the East to bear with its skill in astronomy, wise counsel and the rest, and the rich profits from this. The parallel with Job's 3 comforters may be the reason why the legend of the precisely 3 kings developed. This may also reflect the 3 oriental gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, though this may also express the variety of gifts rather than the number of persons. In any case, the adoration of the Magi represents the homage of the fabled wisdom and wealth of the East to the newborn child. This imitation is primarily building on the homage of the Queen of Sheba, herself fabulously wise and wealthy, when she comes to King Solomon. However, by far the most prominent and most important piece of imitative historiography in Matthew is the depiction of Jesus as the new Moses. Just as Moses founded the people of God and gave the law on the mountain, so Jesus founded the new people of God and gave the new law, the Sermon on the Mount. At the Transfiguration, Jesus is supported by Moses, and finally he sends out his messengers from the holy mountain, just as Moses. Now, in the infancy stories, the imitative historiography is extended backwards to the beginning of his life, just as the evil monarch, Pharaoh, attempted to destroy the infant Moses, so Herod attempts to destroy Jesus. Just as Moses is forced into exile, so Jesus is forced to leave his homeland and flee into exile. Just as the other newborns are killed by Pharaoh, so other newborn boys are killed by Herod. The clearest indication of all is that Jesus is following the path of the clearest indication of all that Jesus is following the path of Moses is that the angel's command to return. The angel says, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who are seeking the child's life are dead." This, in Matthew, coincides exactly with the Lord's message to Moses, "Go, return to Egypt, for all those who sought to kill you are dead," in Exodus 4:19. None of this, of course, is historically impossible or even improbable. King Herod found no difficulty in killing his wives or sons on the mere suspicion of an attempt to supplant him. Herod's friend, the Emperor Augustus, neatly punned in Greek that he would rather be Herod's pig, which is in Greek is hus, pig, than his huios, son. But Herod, of course, didn't eat pork. When Herod was dying in Jericho, he gave orders that all the notables of the land should be assembled in the theatre of Jericho so that they could be killed at his own death, and that would ensure that there was proper mourning in the land. There would hardly have been enough boys in the little town of Bethlehem to make their killing a worry for Herod. It is, of course, impossible to establish independently how accurately the details of the gospel story correspond to history. Luke certainly seems to have muddled about the register of the whole world. More likely, there may well have been a local census of Judea within a few years of Jesus' birth, whenever that was, when the country came directly under Roman rule and taxation. There's also a muddle about dating, for Quirinius became governor of Syria in 6 AD, whereas King Herod died some 10 years earlier. Luke may have used this census to show that Jesus was a son of David in the sense that he was appropriately born in Bethlehem. Neither of these errors makes any difference to the theological message of the stories. In the genre of imitative historiography, it's the message, rather than the geographical details or details of dating, that are important. In both these stories, then, the full impact of the infancy narratives may be best perceived if they are viewed as examples of imitative historiography. Thank you.